Hey everyone, so I just finished the what I thought was a quite enjoyable book, Paul, His Story, on the Apostle Paul by the Catholic scholar Jerome Murphy O'Connor. I quite enjoyed it. I thought it is a really accessible, helpful, single volume look at Paul's life. He engages in quite a lot of speculation about Paul's psychology and Paul's motives, but it was quite interesting, especially had a lot of really good insights on what Paul's travels would have looked like around that part of the world at that time. So I found it as an enjoyable book, but nevertheless, it got me thinking about what are my favorite books about Paul. And so I thought I'd put together a quick video going over some of my favorite books about Paul and a little bit about why. I thought it might be of interest to you who are watching. Perhaps if you haven't heard of these titles, it might be something that you might consider picking up. But quickly, I just want to say Paul is one of those figures that it's kind of people love to hate Paul. If you're not that familiar with him other than just hearing about him as the Apostle Paul, he wrote a lot of the New Testament. Many of his letters have been preserved. Letters to early Christian communities in the ancient Near Eastern world are preserved in the New Testament. And he's a really towering figure. Whichever way you cut it, he's a towering figure in the history of Christianity, and also, I would argue, broadly in the history of kind of Western thinking, because especially Western European thinking and Christianity are so intermingled, right, historically, that Paul's influence on Christianity is also felt as influence in the broader world. And so he's an interesting figure, a guy who was a very radical, zealous, Pharisaical Jew, who converted to the Jesus way in the first century and then traveled around that part of the world and founded Jesus-following communities and then wrote letters to them which have been preserved as scripture. I mean, it's an interesting, I would argue whether or not you're a Christian or have any interest in Christianity as a faith per se, you should find Paul probably an interesting historical figure. So hopefully this video will be of interest to you, even if you don't consider yourself a Christian. But I wanted to just quickly note, in addition to Jerome O'Connor's book, which I think is good, is interesting, I want to note 5 books on Paul that I quite like for very different reasons. They're some of my favorite books on Paul, hence the title of this video. So real quick, one other quick note. I'm not considering any specific commentaries on specific books by Paul. I have some of those on my shelf too, some of which have a lot of value for different reasons, but I'm specifically thinking of books that are kind of single volume works on Paul as a whole, whether that's Paul's whole life, all of Paul's writings, but some kind of bigger zoomed out version as opposed to just looking at a single letter or document from Paul. So, without further ado, I'll get into the list. I organized these 5 books in terms of what I consider easiest to read first and then most difficult or academic last. So I'm stepping through them easiest to most difficult to read, most technical to read in that sense. And so here we go. The first book is Paul, an Apostle's Journey by Douglas Campbell. I loved this book. It's very short. It's the first on my list because I think it's probably the easiest one to read. If you're looking for an engaging, I would say like compelling and gripping single volume look at Paul's life, this is the best place to go. Douglas Campbell is known, he writes a lot of much more technical academic work too under what's known as the apocalyptic interpretation of Paul's work. But you don't need to know any of that or kind of even be fluent or cognizant of any of that kind of work to enjoy this book. It's a great book that just goes through Paul's life. And like any book this way, O'Connor's is the same. There's a lot, you have to speculate a lot if you're going to read or write a single volume biography of sorts of Paul. You have to speculate, you have to fill in some gaps that we just don't have. So if you're comfortable with that, some maybe super conservative people with evangelical conservative backgrounds might be less comfortable with some of the critical look that people like Douglas Campbell or Jerome O'Connor take towards Paul's work or Luke's history and Acts. So depending on who you are, I don't know, you may or may not have some comfortability with that. But that all being said, I think everyone who has an interest in Paul should read this just because it's so enjoyable, so insightful. The way he handles Paul's writing of Galatians is really interesting in this book. The way he handles the mental crisis, potential depression or anxiety that Paul faced before he wrote 2 Corinthians really interesting. I just really like this book a lot. Would highly recommend Paul and Apostle's Journey as an intro to Paul's life of sorts. So that's Doug Campbell. Number 2 is Sarah Rudin's great book, Paul Among the People. What I love about this book is Sarah Rudin is actually not a theologian. She is a classics specialist, a scholar on classics literature. She's actually primarily known for some of her translations of ancient poetry and ancient literature. So she, to my delight, she took that expertise as really an expert in classical literature and turned her lens towards Paul's writings as an ancient classical writer. And so the way that she's not trying to make a theological case per se, she's really trying to look at Paul as a writer among the classics. And her experience gives her just a wealth of knowledge about how Paul compares to the ethics of classical writers, the philosophies of classical writers, especially in our day and age, which I said that Paul is a figure that people kind of love to hate. People accuse him of things like misogyny and all that stuff. Being backwards, being ethnocentric and primitive and those kinds of things. Sarah Rudin really puts him in a context that I think some of those anachronistic readings of Paul just don't hold up to the ways that she analyzes his writings. And it's just a really enjoyable book to read. It's a fresh take on Paul in a world of historical, grammatical, all kinds of critical biblical studies work. So I really like Sarah Rudin's work here in Paul Among the People. If that sounds of interest to you, if you're someone who's interested in classics, definitely check that one out. I'm just tossing these on the floor as I finish them because I don't have room on my table. This next one is Paul and the Giants of Philosophy, which came out recently. I think it came out in 2019. This is a series of essays. It's actually also pretty short. It's a series of essays, and the styles of each essay are pretty different, so it's not quite as smoothly readable as maybe the first two. But what I so appreciate about this book is it brings something not totally unique, but definitely fresh and different, in that, as the title indicates, this steps through and compares Paul to other philosophers of the ancient world. So where Sarah Rudin's work is about the classic literature angle, this is about the classic philosophy angle. And so Paul is compared to people like Seneca, for example, and Paul's thoughts on things ranging from friendship to how do you handle suffering to joy. His work as a philosopher or a philosophical thinker is set against other philosophers of the ancient world, and it just brings out a layer of Paul's thinking that I think in our culture, at least the culture I grew up in, we don't tend to go to very readily. And so that's why I really appreciate this book. I am someone who is particularly interested in philosophy in general, and so I love the idea of thinking about how does Paul stack up as a philosopher, not just a missionary or an apostle or the ways that we typically think of him, but what kind of philosophical work did he do in constructing his writings and encouraging the earliest Jesus followers to be faithful to this who they believe to be the Jewish Messiah, who was crucified and resurrected? So Paul and the Giants of Philosophy, great, handy little book, especially something different next to a lot of commentaries and critical work on Paul. Two more, and these are getting into a little bit more academic, technical writing. So just know that you got to do a little heavy lifting for these next two. But Garwood Anderson's Paul's New Perspective, I really like this book, and I wish it was getting, to my knowledge, I'm not seeing it get a lot of attention. It came out a couple years ago. It's not that new, but I just loved the case that he made in this book. It's a little long. It's fairly technical. It's solidly academic. But if you're familiar with the world of Paul and Pauline scholarship and interpretation, there's this really strong debate it seems to have tapered off a bit, but it's still a pretty strong debate between what's known as the old or traditional perspective on Paul and the new perspective on Paul. I don't have time in this video to get into what that means, but Paul's New Perspective, the title is kind of riffing on that split between old perspective and new perspective. And I just think that the interpretive lens that Garwood Anderson uses here charts a really helpful course to move the conversation past the debating points. In a nutshell, he basically posits that the new perspective scholars are are better readers of Paul's earlier letters, and the traditional perspective scholars are better readers of Paul's later letters in Paul's own career. So the way Paul handled his writing actually developed over the course of his ministry and missionary work, based on the cases he was trying to make early on, when the idea of Jesus being the Jewish Messiah for the whole world, including Gentiles, when that idea was new and needed a certain mode of defense, Paul wrote in a certain way. This is all Garwood Anderson's idea, essentially, argument. But then as that idea developed and as Paul started to pastor and shepherd communities who were then starting to learn about the further and deeper implications of that, the way Paul unpacked it and defended it changed. So I think it's a really, really tantalizing idea. I don't think it's the final open and shut case for it, but I just love the way this book handles that kind of intransigent debate, and really pushes the conversation in a new direction. I think it deserves more attention, more engagement than, at least from what I've seen, it's gotten. And I would highly recommend it, particularly if you're someone who's a little more on the academic technical reading kind of interest level, and you aren't sure what to make of the debate between old and new perspectives. I'd highly recommend this book. So that's Paul's New Perspective. One more, which actually is some similar characteristics as the Garwood Anderson's book, but that is Stephen Westerholm's fantastic book, Perspectives Old and New on Paul. Again, this is Old and New Perspective is a huge, huge piece of this title, and it's a huge piece of Westerholm's work here. But I think in a way that title is a little misleading, because this is more of just a summary of a couple recent centuries of scholarship on Paul, and it's amazing as it's just a treasure trove of summaries of work on Paul from a ton of famous scholars. I mean, Jimmy Dunn and N.T. Wright, of course, are in here, and so is Tom Schreiner and C.B. Cranfield, and so is Albert Schweitzer from the previous century. And I mean, I've barely scratched the surface of people that Westerholm summarizes in here. But he starts the book with summaries of people like Wesley and Calvin. I'm really glad he included John Wesley in that section, by the way, and Augustine, of course. So he gives some really, really helpful summaries of those thinkers that formed a bit of a bedrock of the Western approach to Paul. But then the whole second section of this book is this amazing tour through so many different Pauline scholars from really the 1900s and the 20th century time frame. But it goes a little bit around that time frame too. But man, as a kind of reference book, as a source of summaries, they're really, really fair, I think, incisive and fair, balanced summaries of these thinkers, where some critiques are leveled, but mostly it's just really, really helpful summaries of these different takes on Paul. And then, of course, Westerholm does offer his own kind of response to all of this debate between particularly old and new perspective. And the last section is his take on that, in which he essentially lands on a very, very nuanced kind of Lutheran traditional old perspective take, which you may or may not totally land on. But I think that this is a fantastic, even-handed, fairly written, extremely helpful summary of a lot of critical and academic engagement with Paul. And I just love it. I love pulling this book off the shelf and refreshing different ways, myself on different ways people have talked about Paul. And I just love that Stephen Westerholm put this together. It's an outstanding book. And so those are 5 of my favorite books on Paul. Hope you found this helpful. I might do other videos like this related to different topics or different thinkers of just some of my favorite books, in the hopes to point people to books that maybe they wouldn't have otherwise heard of and might appreciate. So if you have other thoughts on Paul or other books you'd recommend or other ones that I missed or whatever, leave those thoughts in the comments. And also, if you have ideas of other topics that I might do a similar video on that you'd be interested in, let me know. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you for my next video.